एवरीवन, वेलकम बैक टू माय चैनल। सो कैसे हैं आप सब? आई होप आप सब अच्छे होंगे। सो आज की वीडियो में हम बात करने वाले हैं नेशनलिज्म पर। सो विदाउट वेस्टिंग मोर टाइम लेट्स गेट स्टार्टेड। सो सबसे पहले हम नेशनलिज्म की डेफिनेशन से स्टार्ट करेंगे। देखिए, नेशनलिज्म एक ऐसा विश्वास है जो ये मानता है कि अगर लोगों के एक ग्रुप में सभी लोग इक्वल हिस्ट्री रखते हैं, इक्वल ट्रेडिशन से जुड़े हैं, लैंग्वेज, कल्चर, इन सब से अगर वो जुड़े हैं तो उन्हें अपना एक सोवरेन पॉलिटिकल कम्युनिटी बनानी चाहिए। एक ऐसा ग्रुप जिसमें सेम ट्रेडिशन के लोग, सेम कम्युनिटी के लोग एक साथ जुड़ जाएं। ठीक है। बेसिकली इन कम्युनिटी ग्रुप्स मेंबर्स की जो हिस्ट्री होती है वो ऑलमोस्ट सेम ही होती है। ठीक है। देखो, एक फिलोसफर है जिनका नाम हैंस कोन है। उनके अकॉर्डिंग नेशनलिज्म नेशन स्टेट की मांग करता है। ठीक है। और नेशन स्टेट का क्रिएशन नेशनलिज्म को स्ट्रॉन्ग बनाता है। ओके। देखो, 21st सेंचुरी में इकोनॉमिक ग्लोबलाइजेशन, मास माइग्रेशन और टेक्नोलॉजिकल एडवांसमेंट्स की वजह से दुनिया के अलग अलग हिस्सों में लोग आपस में जुड़ गए हैं। ओवर द ग्लोब लोगों की लाइफस्टाइल बहुत ज़्यादा सिमिलर हो गई है, जिसकी वजह से क्या हो रहा है, नेशनल आइडेंटिटी बहुत हद तक इररेलेवेंट बन गई है। बेसिकली दे यूज द सेम स्लैंग, ट्रेवल इन द सेम मैनर एंड इवन ईट द सेम फूड। सो बेसिकली नेशनलिज्म मॉडर्न स्टेट का ही एक पार्ट है। So when you pick up the world at last, you will see that every single inch of land in this world has been divided according to the principle of nationalism. This fact may not strike you as particularly profound unless you dwell on the fact that this was not always so. When we think of the nation that we live in today, it seems to be a natural, unsigned, and stable political formation. However, the nation state was not always the manner in which a political community was organized. Ancient Greece was composed of city-states. Ancient India was composed of republics and kingdoms. And since the Roman Empire, Europe has been ruled by successive monarchs or dynasties in decentralized feudal kingdoms and empires. In fact, nationalism is no more than 200 years old. So, if nationalism is historically such a recent phenomenon, how did it become such a powerful and universally accepted doctrine? How and where did it arise and how did it spread around the world? What is the connection between nationalism and the modern state? The first section of this chapter answers these questions by outlining the major events and factors in this historical journey of nationalism, especially its connection with the modern state. So there are several theoretical questions about nationalism that arise too. These include, what is the relationship of nationalism with modern culture and capitalism? Is there a difference between Eastern and Western nationalism? Is nationalism inherently progressive or regressive political phenomena? The second half of the chapter seeks answers to these questions by examining the major theoretical debates in this field. Now, the history of an idea. Nationalism is commonly regarded by historians as having originated in Europe, and more specifically in Western Europe, from where it spread to other parts of the world. While nationalism, as mentioned above, arose in the late 18th and 19th century, certain political and military events in Europe began to create the condition for the rise of nations as early as 14th century. These include the decline of the Holy Roman Empire and the 100 Years' War between the English and French kingdoms. The most important factor for the rise of nationalism, however, was the rise of centralized modern state in Europe. Around the 16th and 17th centuries, nationalism has a structural connection with the state and could not have emerged prior to its existence. Thus, it is important to first understand the rise of the state. The modern state differs from pre-modern political formations because it embodies centralized, sovereign, undivided political power. In contrast, in medieval Europe, political power was divided instead of being consolidated in the hands of a single sovereign ruler or government. Although monarchs and ruling dynasties existed, they shared power both horizontally and vertically. The horizontal division of power at the apex of the political system existed because of the church being as powerful as individual rulers, and often even more powerful than them. The power of the church had steadily grown ever since the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire. Constantine in the 4th century AD. The adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire meant the dissemination of church authority to the farthest corners of the Roman Empire, which means most of the continent of Europe and as far east as Turkey and Asia. By the 6th century AD, there existed overlapping zones of authority between the Catholic Church and individual rulers of kingdoms all across Europe. While on the one hand, kings justified their rule over subjects by claiming that they possessed divine sanction, the church exercised political control in the non religious secular sense, for instance, in the power to tax subjects. The vertical check on the ruler's power in medieval Europe was provided by the feudal structure. Feudal was a system of social stratification which existed throughout medieval Europe. It consisted of ties of obligation between superiors and subordinates, which emphasized the performance of one's given duty in accordance with one's place in the hierarchy. It is important to remember that the feudal system functioned at both economic and political levels in the largely agrarian economics of medieval European kingdoms, and individual status were primarily determined by his/her relationship to the main economic asset. Nationalism thus arose as a powerful unifying force in the modern era, allowing the bourgeois to speak in the name of seemingly primordial community called the nation while bargaining for greater political power within their respective modern states. So, how did nationalism become a popular or mass phenomenon? For the masses, nationalism served a similar purpose as discussed above the context of the elites' opposition to political power. To simplify a complex picture, as absolutist monarchs struggled to hold to their power in the face of decreasing support from the bourgeois, they resorted to increasingly desperate and despotic forms of rule. As a response to this, the masses took to the streets in protest, and there were successive waves of popular pressure on absolutist states. For example, the French Revolution of 1789. We may clarify here that while revolts, mutinies, and uprisings against political power have existed from time immemorial, by the 18th and 19th century in Europe, these popular revolts were increasingly expressed in nationalist terms. Often, the leadership of the national movement would remain in the hands of elites and the popular element would ebb and flow. Occasionally, a local rebellion against a ruler or provincial governor would be strategically utilized by the bourgeois in order to launch a full scale nationalist agitation against the monarch. So, to summarize and conclude this section, as absolutist states transformed into limited or constitutional states, and finally to democratic states towards the end of the 19th century. Nationalism became a rallying call for greater political power or rights for both the bourgeois and the masses in the modern state. It is important to remember that the above is only a simplified sketch. Nationalism has differed vastly according to specific historical, culture, and geographical conditions in various parts of Europe and elsewhere. For example, in France, the violent mass element was stronger than it was in England. Hence, it was the mass political groups that participated in the French Revolution rather than a parliament that created and popularized the idea of French nation as an embodiment of liberty in opposition to the excesses of absolutism. So, in many parts of Europe, nationalism, even among the elites, arose as late as the 19th century. The reasons for this phenomena may be found in the different geographical and cultural conditions and divergent processes of state formation in these areas. In England, state formation had taken place under relatively peaceful conditions due partly to its geographical and cultural isolation from the rest of Europe. Hence, a distinctive English nation could be shaped within the boundaries of existing English state. However, where large multi-ethnic, multilinguistic empires had transformed into states, the boundaries of nation and states did not always neatly consign. These empires initially became multinational states, which gradually broke up into the nation states. So, the phenomena of nationalism was more conflict ridden and often violent in these areas. One clear example of this could be seen in the history of nations like Bosnia and Herzegovina that were born from the debris of the old Austro Hungarian Empire. In these areas, nationalists arose to demand the creation of the nation state, rather than merely for the establishment of a subjective sense of loyalty among the population of existing states. So, in the case of Germany, too, the nation state of Germany was created in the 19th century out of the princely republics that comprised the crumbling Holy Roman Empire. Okay. Okay, now come to the next topic, which is non-European nationalism. So within Europe, nationalism had spread from the elites to the masses by the end of 19th century. At this time, nationalism also began to spread from Europe to other parts of the world. The salient factors in this regard were trade and colonialism. As early as the 18th century, European powers were engaged in securing lucrative trading outposts around the globe. By the end of the 19th century, the search became a mad scramble for colonies. As European powers opened up inner territories of Asia, Africa, and Latin America for their own profit and exposed the native populations to the outside world, they ironically dug their own graves by fueling national liberation struggles in their colonies. So, just as popular revolts had opposed despotic rulers within Europe, national liberation struggles in the colonies expressed popular frustration at arbitrary and unjust colonial policies. Interestingly, the leadership of national liberation movements were initially in the hands of the bourgeois in the colonies too, often foreign educated professional middle classes who saw themselves as leaders of an indigenous nation opposing the imperialist European nations. So, gradually, the mass element began to enter anti colonial nationalism. In the Indian case, for example, historians have argued that the importance of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was precisely ineffective a transformation of Indian nationalism from the limited middle class nationalism of the Indian National Congress in the 1890s and 1900s to a radical mass movement from the 1920s onwards. The solidarity between various liberation struggles may have been an additional factor in the demise of colonialism and the rise of non European nationalism. Anti colonial nationalist movements benefited from communication between colonized areas, which was ironically made possible by colonialism itself. For instance, the defeat of an imperialist power like Russia by a teeny Asian nation, Japan in 1904 to 1905 created a tremendous sense of confidence all over the colonized non European world. Similarly, the non cooperation movement launched by Gandhi in India expressed solidarity with the anti colonial Khilafat movement in Turkey. Further, after World War, the legitimacy of imperialism as a principle of political rule had decreased considerably at an international level. The growing success of Asian African anti colonial struggles made imperial an increasingly expensive enterprise both materially and morally. Materially, colonies become not simply ungovernable but also unprofitable for many reasons. Morally, imperialism was opposed not simply by nationalist leaders and masses in the colonies, but also by liberal democratic governments that had been elected to power in Europe. So, due to combination of the above factors, there was a wave of decolonization in the colonized world after World War II. And by the third quarter of the 20th century, modern nation state had been established in the most of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Okay. Now let's discuss some theoretical question. First one is nationalism and modern culture. What is the difference between both of them? Many writers have attempted to examine the precise connection between nationalism and modern culture. These include Karl Wolfgang Deutsch, who argues in his work Nationalism and Social Communication 1962. The nationalism is an expression of cultural and social mechanisms peculiar to modernity, such as modern communications. Ernest Gellner's Nations and National 1983 is an important attempt to understand the role of cultural factors in nationalism. Gellner argues that it is not nations that create nationalism but rather the nationalists create nations. A fact that certainly seems to be true for the history of most recent nation states. In this process, according to Gellner, the principle of nationalism assert a homogenizing pressure on pre-modern culture, exploiting them and transforming them to fulfill its project of creating a homogeneous national culture. Nationalism also obliterates obscure little traditions and reinvents and homogeneous great traditions in order to create a basis for the modern nation. Gellner's analysis can be used by us to understand the rise of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva in India. Hindutva seeks to promote the development of a Hindu Indian nation by a propagandization of a homogenized Hindu high culture that ignores diverse local folkloric tradition in favor of a limited set of upper caste Sanskrit traditions. This project of Hindutva is expressed in the demand for a common national language, Sanskritized Hindi, a common deity Lord Ram, and a common place of worship for all Hindus, the site of Lord Ram's birth in the North Indian city of Ayodhya. This last demand was expressed as the Ram Janmabhoomi movement and culminated in the destruction of the mosque, the Babri Masjid, that allegedly stood at the site of Ram's birthplace. Interestingly, there is also a continued reference in the Hindutva discourse to a glorious ancient past, the Vedic age. As the origin, which means root, of the Hindu nation, as mentioned above, the idea of common origin or birth is a part of the history of nationalism in Western Europe too. In this aspect, Hindu nationalism is strikingly similar of German Romantic nationalism mentioned above. Gallus also seeks to demonstrate that nationalism has a structural connection with the needs of modern industrial society. He argues that social organization of agrarian society is not at all favorable to the nationalist principle. According to him, the need of modern industrial economies for a mobile and interchangeable workforce requires complex new skills and social formations beyond the resources of family and kinship ties. Such skills, according to Gallner, can only be provided by a public education system and integrated by peripherally. Okay, next, nationalism and capitalism. The relationship between nationalism and capitalism has been analyzed by the Marxists and non-Marxists alike. Marxists argue that during the 4 centuries old development of capitalism and nationalism has to a great extent arisen as an ally of capitalism as a bourgeois ideology. For example, Hobsbawm believes that nationalism is the symptom of capitalism. At a particular stage of its development, nationalism unites the dominant classes, the bourgeois, and creates a false sense of community between them and the masses in the face of the latter's impoverishment and exploitation by capitalism. Marxists believe that nationalism offers individuals an identity and a means to belong to a community that seems egalitarian and unified but actually is not so. This is because all nations are characterized by deep economic and social inequalities even today. Thus, Marxists would argue that the unity in nationalist thought can be a mythical one and does not reflect the real conditions of human beings in the modern, predominantly capitalist world. Benedict Anderson, an influential writer on nationalism, expresses this Marxist insight when he calls nations imagined communities. Okay, now let's discuss nationalism, Western or Eastern. The question of whether there is a difference between Eastern and Western nationalism is a thorny one since Western thinkers or nationalists have often used positive terminology to describe Western nationalism and negative terminology for Eastern nationalism. For instance, according to Hans Kohn, Western nationalism was connected with the concepts of individual liberty. The latter nationalism in Central and Eastern Europe and in Asia easily tended towards a contrary development. Edward Shills similarly believes that one can draw a clear demarcation between the West and the East on the question of nationalism. Shills argues that rather than the secular rational reasons that draw people into politics in the Western nations, the people of the East are drawn into politics because of what he calls their deep preoccupation with authority. With the collapse of traditional sources of political authority due to colonialism in the East, the Eastern individual longs for incorporation into a new alternative collectivity. According to Shills, nationalism in the eastern states can be understood as an expression of this overwhelming irrational need. Theorists also argue that since nationalism is imported into non-Western states by colonialism, it tends to be a more artificial and unstable phenomena here, spawning dangerous tendencies toward violence and extremism. Alright? Now, nationalist, progressive, or regressive. There has always existed a debate between those theorists who view nationalism as a conservative, retrograde phenomenon and those who view it as progressive and desirable. The dismissal of nationalism as a regressive or even reactionary force has come from a diverse set of political and ideological positions. Marxism, as mentioned above, has traditionally been hostile to nationalism. For example, Rosa Luxemburg believed that nationalism instilled a lens of loyalty in the minds of the working class towards the existing state and towards the ruling classes that are allied with the state. Luxemburg argued that even if the idea of the right of nations to self-determination was relevant or meaningful to the mass of the world's population at some point, it had become meaningless or impossible under modern capitalist conditions. Many writers have opposed nationalism for its narrow particularism and its capacity to construct the myth of homogeneous identity. The great Indian poet and writer Rabindranath Tagore remained deeply suspicious of nationalism throughout his life for these reasons. Okay? Paul Gilroy, in his book The Black Atlantic, which is written by Paul Gilroy in 1993, reminds us that marginalization of diverse traditions and experiences seems inbuilt into nationalism anywhere in the world. Okay, support for nationalism has also come from diverse and sometimes surprising quarters. The influential Marxist scholar Azaz Ahmad understands nationalism in a manner similar to Ernest Gellner when he argues that nationalism may be a stage in the often painful transition of traditional societies to modernity. As discussed above, Marxism views nationalism as a bourgeois ideology that accompanies the rise of the modern state. Marxists like Ahmad believe that the modern nation state is a necessary historical stage in the ultimate establishment of the stateless, classless society. Therefore, Ahmad does not share the suspicion of the nationalism that some other Marxist thinkers display. Rather, he argues that nationalism may be seen as a cementing force in the transition of societies to modernity and ultimately to socialism, especially for third world states. Nationalism is viewed by many contemporary Marxist writers and activists as a powerful and useful tool to resist the forces of global capitalism. Ahmad, for instance, argues for the actuality, even the necessity of progressive revolutionary kinds of nationalism in order to defend the interests of weaker states in the international hierarchy of states. So most third world nationalism has its roots in anti-colonial struggle. Marxists who characterize the contemporary global economic system as neo-colonial would argue thus that just as nationalism can be used to oppose colonialism, it can be employed to oppose new colonialism and multinational corporation, which means MNCs. In India, for examples, sections of communist political parties have often supported even non-communist national governments in their stand against MNCs. This nationalist position, which stand directly opposed to the traditional pro-working class internationalist stance or Marxist is justified on the basis of the defense of weaker state against the moves of powerful Western multinationals. Okay, now we will discuss analysis and critique. As regards the connection between nationalism and modern culture, the idea common to the theory discussed above is that nationalism is the religion of modernization or the ideological corollary to the material fact of modernization. There is no doubt that nationalism has a structural connection with modernization, as is envisaged by its rise 2 centuries ago. Nationalism may have provided individuals from different classes with a sense of identity and connection in the face of the massive economic and political upheavals that accompanied modernity. However, it must be emphasized that neither modernization per nor its connection with nationalism is a straightforward phenomena. First, nationalism often works against modernization, as is the case with nationalist economic opposition to international trade agreements, even where it can be demonstrated that the new rules would foster industrial modernization in the country. So, Gellner's analysis also becomes somewhat untenable when we consider nationalism in the developing world. Most third world countries today are composed of combinations of agrarian and industrial forms of production. In other words, instead of having witnessed a neat transition from agrarian to industrial society, this world society seem to simultaneously contain all the stages of historical development that Gellner speaks of. Second, the distinction between Eastern and Western nationalism must be questioned. The tendency to view all Eastern nationalism as somehow lacking in the healthy values associated with Western nationalism is very common in conventional literature. For instance, Schills in the context of Eastern nationalism argues that it contains a deficient trend of civility, right? So the distinction between cultural and political nationalism may be more useful. However, most scholars see Western nationalism as political and Eastern ones as cultural. This distinction remains controversial since some writers have argued that exact opposite, whereas most European nations emerged organically from indigenous historical processes. Colonized nations are highly artificial creations since their boundaries have been constructed by the imperial powers. So they would argue that Western nations are cultural whereas Eastern nations are political. Okay. For instance, Kedoric points to the revolutionary element in Indian nationalism with its worship of the goddess Kali as having the same roots as the irrational, violent, spiritual and collective elements in the romantic nationalism of Europe. Also, the idea of a liberal, reasonable, cosmopolitan Western nationalism that is devoid of any unhealthy values, including resentment and xenophobia, may be a normative idea rather than reality in Western states. Paul Gilroy's analysis of nationalism in Western states discussed above may be useful to remember in this regard. In fact, the historian John Bewley believes that the welding of universalities, political discourse with the particularistic ethnic one constitutes the fundamental principle of all nationalism. Now we will see conclusion, the future of an idea. At the start of the 21st century, increasing economic globalization, mass migration and technological advancements like the internet and mobile phones seem to have dramatically shrunk the planet. The lifestyles of the elites all over the globe are now strikingly similar for many classes of people. National identity has become irrelevant at the everyday level. They use the same slang, travel in the same manner, and even eat the same food. Migration of human beings has increased manifold with the huge number of individuals seeking to live and work in countries far away from their own. Writers argue that in the face of an increasingly globalized world, old political formations like the nation will lose their earlier role and relevance. David Bentham, for instance, argues that very forces that strengthened nationalism in the previous era will cause its downfall in the coming one. So, Some writers believe that rather than national formation, it is transnational economic and political alliances that will set the agenda for the world's people in this. And in the coming centuries, in this context, writers point the example of the EU as proof of the decline of the nation state. Europe being widely regarded as a birthplace of nationalism, the formation of the EU on this very continent has led some writers to believe that nationalism and other such primitive ideologies will be overcome in the new epoch. Many writers and political commentators believe that the coming centuries will move in the direction of cosmopolitan, universal global values, and the national bloodbath of the previous century will be distant memories. So, however, into the 21st century, a decline of nationalism seems nowhere in evidence. Nationalism as a political force seems alive and well. So, to conclude, it may be useful to understand nationalism as a universal contemporary political phenomenon, not simply an occasional spectacular outpouring of patriotic sentiment, but as a part of the history of the modern state. Nationalism has often joined the hands with the democratic state and liberal politics, as the experience of third world leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, and Kenyatta has shown. It can be a powerful transformative force that can achieve miracles in large, impoverished societies, as expressed in the idea of nation building. Nationalism has especially been an ally for post-colonial societies seeking to unite large and diverse populations and fulfill difficult developmental goals with an unequal global capitalist system. However, it has also become enwed with more dangerous ideologies like religious extremism of any sort, fundamentalism, and even fascism. To understand why nationalism can be healthy or regressive, powerful, or limited in its scope, one must remember above all the historical contingencies that accompanied its rise, and in particular its complex historical relationship with the modern state. The blending of the universal and the particular, the banal and the spectacular, the routine and the extraordinary, the reasonable and the irrational is what constitutes the most striking feature of nationalism anywhere in the world, and perhaps gives us a compelling explanation for the continuing power of this ideology well into the 21st century. Alright, so that's all for today, guys. I hope you understand all the points clearly. If you have any doubt, feel free to ask any question to me. If you like this video, kindly hit the like button and do subscribe my YouTube channel. See you in the next video. Till then, bye bye. Take care.